I was hanging up the tablecloth when my phone buzzed softly in my apron pocket. A message from my son, just one short line. "Mom, someone's coming to see the house today. Can you show them around for us?" I stared at the screen, clothespin still in hand, frozen mid-motion. The sentence wasn't long, but it felt like someone had given me a gentle shove from behind, just enough to knock me off balance. "See the house," I repeated quietly, trying to recall if I'd missed any conversation about selling. But my mind is still sharp enough to know this was the first I'd heard of it. This house, where I've lived for almost 15 years, wasn't the one Matthew and I shared, but it holds everything I brought with me from that life. Matthew never set foot in this house, yet every brick, every doorknob reminds me of him. We bought it with what we had built together, and I filled it with the remnants of our past. The curtains I sewed myself from leftover fabric in our old grocery shop. I packed the chipped teacups because he used to say, "Anything you're used to, if it's clean, it's still worth keeping." My son, his wife, and their 2 kids live upstairs. I'm on the first floor with my bedroom, a small kitchen, and a little path out to the backyard, where I still tend to the lavender and herbs each morning. We don't live like a traditional family anymore. It counts as living together, since there are days I don't hear a single voice except for the hurried footsteps rushing down the stairs. But I'd thought I was still a part of this house, at least enough to be asked before strangers were invited to inspect every corner. A while later, the doorbell rang, a young couple dressed neatly and with polite smiles as I opened the door. "We're here about the Zillow listing," the woman said, glancing around. The man stepped inside, asking about sunlight, soundproofing, and whether the downstairs could be converted into a garage. I didn't know how to answer. I hadn't seen this house on Zillow. I certainly hadn't approved of someone uploading photos of my bedroom with a caption that read, "Bonus room, potential storage." I offered them some water out of habit. They declined with a polite smile, took one last look around, and thanked me. When the door closed behind them, I stood still in the hallway. My slippers echoed faintly on the gray tile floor. Tiles I chose because they looked clean and stayed cool, the kind Matthew would have picked for the shop's kitchen. What I felt then wasn't quite anger, not exactly sadness either. It was more like the sensation of returning to a place you used to call home, only to find your name quietly removed from the mailbox, without warning, without a word. I still remember the first time I stepped into that tiny storefront on the corner of Roosevelt and Maple, not as a customer, but as its owner. It had once been a cramped locksmith shop, heavy with the smell of oil and iron, but when Matthew brought me to see it, he said, "All we need is 2 shelves, a fridge, and a doorbell, then we're good to go." We repainted the walls a soft white mixed with pale green, and bought clear glass jars to hold almonds, gummy bears, olives, and anchovies in oil. The first sign was handwritten, "April's Pantry," because Matthew was born in April, and I've always believed good things begin in spring. On opening day, we had 4 customers and 3 neighbors. But that night I slept as soundly as if I'd never known the meaning of the word worry. We lived in the loft above the shop, a tiny room with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the red-tiled rooftops of town. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. I handled the bookkeeping in the early mornings, and Matthew did the supply runs. At night, I counted coins while he brewed tea and tuned the radio to classical music. Together, we picked every floor tile, every drawer handle, every mug for our regulars. Whenever someone paid in coins, Matthew would joke, "Keep saving, one day we'll buy ourselves a juicer." We never bought that juicer. But what we did buy was time together in the little things. Folding paper bags, wiping down the display case, knitting winter headscarves, reading menus aloud to older people with fading eyesight. When Matthew died, I thought I'd never need another home again. My heart felt hollow, not because he left too suddenly, but because no one was saying, "Go on to bed, I'll lock up." After the funeral, I tried to keep the shop open for 2 more months. But every afternoon, standing behind the counter and hearing someone ask, "Is Matthew not here today?" would leave me speechless. So I put up a closed sign and packed what was left into a new home, just as my son had suggested. "Sell the old place, Mom, and we'll all find a house big enough for the whole family. I want you to be near the kids, not living alone anymore." At the time, I lived alone in an empty attic apartment. Dinners were made of cold pasta, and the hum of talk radio. When my son said that, it felt like someone dipped my tired heart in warm honey. I didn't overthink it. If I could contribute, our future together would feel more complete. I sold the shop, withdrew my savings, and added to Matthew's life insurance. But the new house, the one we bought, was listed in my son's name. The bank required it, they said. I didn't mind. Back then, I still believed that we belonged to one another as long as we lived together. The early years were good. I picked up Evan from school, cooked dinner, did the laundry, and taught him to read using the old Grimm storybook Matthew once kept. On holidays, I made nougat by hand, strung up lights out front, wrote greeting cards, and placed them on the breakfast tray. I never expected thanks. Hearing my grandson call Grandma each morning was enough. But things began to change when my daughter-in-law landed a new job. Then Evan got his phone. Then I was politely asked to stay downstairs to give everyone some space. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I retreated into my small corner of the house, keeping my old habits alive. Steeping tea, tending the lavender, writing little notes to stick on the fridge, notes no one read anymore. I always thought, if I stayed patient, family closeness would return like springtime. But that spring, I realized I was the only one still speaking of spring in this house. When I moved in with them, I made coffee every morning, poured it into a thermal carafe, and left a note. It's chilly today, don't forget a jacket. At first, my daughter-in-law would smile and say, thanks, Mom. But gradually, the note stayed stuck on the fridge, dry and curling at the edges, never peeled off. One morning, I walked upstairs and found the kids having breakfast. I said good morning, but no one replied. I poured myself a glass of water, and my daughter-in-law stepped out of her room and said gently but clearly, Mom, maybe it's better if we handle the kitchen, just to keep things less chaotic. I nodded. Not hurt, not surprised. Just nodded. And from that day on, I stopped going upstairs. I stayed downstairs in my corner of the house, a house I had helped pay for, now reduced to a side room. On the rare evenings we had dinner together, the conversations around the table left no room for me. My daughter-in-law talked about coworkers, my son discussed finances, and the kids were glued to their phones. I placed a serving on Evan's plate. He gently pushed it aside, whispering, Grandma, I don't eat that. I smiled. That's okay, I'll make something else. But he had already turned away. That night, I did the dishes alone. No one invited me to watch a movie like they did in those early years. No one asked if I wanted dessert. The fridge was packed with food I wasn't supposed to touch. Once, I bought a tub of yogurt, the same brand Matthew used to eat, and placed it on a lower shelf I designated for myself. 3 days later, it was gone. I asked and no one answered. When I said I'd buy another, my daughter-in-law said, Maybe don't keep your stuff separate, Mom. It's hard to share the fridge. Hard to share the fridge. But when they needed help buying the house, they had no trouble sharing everything with me. I didn't argue. I took another step back. I bought a mini fridge and placed it in my room. From then on, no one opened the downstairs fridge but me. One spring afternoon, I left a chocolate muffin, Evan's favorite, outside his door. It was still warm. I didn't knock. I just set it there and returned to the kitchen. Late that night, I went to retrieve the tray. The muffin was untouched, cold, and slightly dented as if someone had accidentally kicked it. I didn't bake another. I wrapped it in brown paper, tossed it in the trash, and then brewed myself a teapot. I sat in the chair by the window, watching golden light filter through the old curtains. On the table was a photo of Matthew standing outside our old shop, sleeves rolled up, smiling gently. I turned the frame slightly and laid it face down. Something inside me ached. Not from hurt but from a deep chill. A chill that didn't come from outside, but from slowly fading out of the lives of people I once believed were my family. No one pushed me out. They stopped noticing I was there. It was as if I were a shadow at the edge of the picture, present but easily forgotten. Another time I texted Evan, Do you want Grandma to mend your torn jacket? 3 hours later he sent back a smiley face sticker. No, yes, no, no words at all. Just an emoji. That night I opened my phone and reread old messages. Grandma, I love you. You make the best cookies. Messages he wrote back when he was in 2nd grade. Now they'd been replaced with misspelled fragments, dry silences. I kept them not out of hope, but because I feared I might forget that I was ever needed one day. And I started keeping track. Not of money but of things lost. The day my daughter-in-law reminded me not to open the door for delivery men, just in case it's not ours. Another day, Evan said my food smells kind of old. Yet another night I was told, "Mom, please don't call after 9, we need our rest." Each comment was small, but I knew they weren't accidental. They were the first cracks in a house once sketched out with promises like "we'll live close, make a happy home together." I hadn't pushed back. I hadn't asked why. But something in me shifted. I began counting. Not the days I lived near my family, but the days I lived in a house with people who had slowly become strangers. I used to think the deepest wounds came from arguments, from sharp words flung like knives. But they don't. They come softer than that, like an offhand comment during a call that hadn't ended. I was folding napkins in my room when my phone buzzed that afternoon. Evan's name appeared. My heart lifted, thinking maybe he needed something. "Grandma's here, sweetheart," I said, but all I heard was background noise, like the call had been dialed by accident. I was about to hang up when I heard Evan's laugh, followed by my daughter-in-law's voice. "She still thinks we love her. All you have to say is 'I miss you, Mom,' and she'll send money or bake something." Evan chuckled. He didn't object. Then my son joined in, his voice even as if telling a joke. "It's easy. If Mom feels useful, she's happy. Never ask why. She's like an emotional ATM." A burst of laughter followed, sharp, like the shatter of a glass hitting tile. I froze. The half-folded napkin was still in my hand, the green thread not yet knotted. I don't know how long I sat there, only the chill from the chair crept through my sweater, not from lack of heat, but from something hollow settling in my chest. They were laughing at me, as if I were a foolish character in a game they played behind my back. I gently set the phone down. No anger. No tears. Just the feeling that a door inside me had quietly shut, slowly but with finality. That evening I cooked as usual. Still chopped vegetables, simmered lentil soup, and placed a portion for Evan on a tray. I heard footsteps upstairs, the TV, and my daughter-in-law typing away. But no one came down to eat. I sat at the kitchen table alone, taking slow spoonfuls of soup. The smell of fried shallots rose, stinging my eyes just enough to remind me I was still capable of feeling. I opened the cupboard below the sink and took out an old softcover notebook I used to track inventory when we ran the store. On the first page I wrote, "Today for 18 p.m. I heard them laugh because they think I'm stupid." I didn't write it to keep a record. I wrote it to remember. Love should never need accounting. And if it does, then it's not love anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed, turned, finally switched on the light, and stared at the water-stained ceiling no one had fixed since last year's rain. I recalled every time I transferred money to my son, Evan's tuition, car repairs, and his wife's birthday. I remembered the time my daughter-in-law cried, saying her mother was sick and needed a night nurse. I emptied my final savings for that. 2 weeks later, I saw photos of them at an Italian restaurant on Instagram. Evan raised a glass, captioned, "My queen deserves it all." I told myself then, maybe it was a special occasion. Now I know what the occasion was, I still believed. The next morning I woke early. My tea had gone cold when I spotted Matthew's old wooden box in the cupboard. Inside were the necklace he gave me on our wedding day, a pair of earrings from his mother, and a delicate women's wristwatch that had long stopped ticking. I took each item out and wiped it gently with a cloth. I hadn't touched them in years. I used to think I'd passed them down to my daughter-in-law. Not anymore. I carefully wrapped them in velvet and placed them in my desk drawer. I don't know what I'll do next. But for the first time in a long time I know one thing for sure. I won't stay silent anymore. And I won't send another cent to people who use the word love like a PIN code. Not ever again. I left on a Monday morning, while the house was still asleep. Not because I wanted to disappear, but because I wanted to see if my absence in silence would be noticed at all. Before leaving, I brewed a pot of tea, folded my blanket neatly, and left the gate key in the kitchen drawer, where the cookie tin used to sit every holiday. I didn't leave a note, message, or even a line. Just an old canvas bag, packed with a few changes of clothes, a jar of dried lavender, and the softcover notebook I had started that night. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the street, the sky still gray, the streetlights fading, the breeze sharp and familiar, like when I first moved into that house. I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't wistful, but because I was afraid that if I did, I might forgive one more time. I took the early bus toward the old neighborhood, where Matthew and I had once lived, worked, and eaten dinner on a makeshift crate table when the store got too busy to cook. The neighborhood had changed. The bakery on the corner had new owners. The old bar had a different sign. But our little grocery store was still there. Shut for years, its sign-peeling windows filmed with dust, the sunlight hitting the glass in a murky sheen. I stood there for a long time, hand gripping my bag, heart swaying with a voice from the past I thought I'd forgotten. The current owner was an older widow who lived in the back apartment. I asked if I could take a look inside for a few minutes. She remembered me, even recalled how I once gave her a jar of lavender oil for her chronic headaches. She invited me in and poured me a light cup of coffee. "I've been thinking of selling the place," she said. "No one wants to rent it anymore. Doesn't turn a profit." I looked around and the walls were chipped, the floor cracked, and the shelves bowed from moisture. But I didn't see those things. I saw Matthew behind the counter, chin resting on his hand as he listened to a customer talk about her cat's new litter. I saw myself folding paper bags, counting coins, hanging the sign that said "Fresh Rye Bread Today." I sat on the warped wooden stool in the corner, which was still there. After all these years, no one had used it, but it hadn't fallen apart. I pulled my notebook from my bag and wrote, "If everything else has changed, I still have the right to sit where I once belonged." I asked her, "If I don't run a business but just want to rent a small living space I can pay monthly. Not much, but steady." She didn't ask for anything more. Just nodded, then pointed toward the loft in the back. "There's still an old bed stored away years ago. If you don't mind, it's yours." I nodded. My heart wasn't loud the way I thought it would be. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. It felt like setting down a suitcase after a journey that had gone on too long. That night I cleaned the little loft, dusted, made the bed, rinsed out the kettle. The smell of damp walls mixed with fresh soap made a scent that felt like a beginning, rough but real. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching the yellow streetlight reflect in the glass. No one called. No message asked, "Mom, where are you?" And for the first time I wasn't hoping anyone would. I just wanted to be here, in the quiet of my choosing, no longer someone who did everything just to be kept near. Not the wounded mother. Not the one holding the purse strings. Just a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had endured, and who was now learning how to let go without breaking. After living in the old grocery store for just over 3 weeks, I began hearing the familiar sound of my footsteps. First it felt strange. The wooden floors creaked, the walls smelled damp, and whenever the wind slipped through the doorframe, the whole room exhaled a faint whistle, like someone sighing. But then I realized those weren't the sounds of loneliness. They were the echoes of memory returning to a place that once knew it well. I laid out the old tablecloth again, pulled from the fabric box beneath the loft, the cloth we used to wrap jars of olives Matthew had preserved. I tuned the shortwave radio to a classical music station and kept it on all day. One afternoon while washing a cup, I froze for a second as a soft waltz played, the very piece Matthew used to put on when we mopped the floors together. I didn't cry. I just set the cup down, stood still momentarily, then smiled. I took my wedding necklace to the pawn shop a week after moving in. Not because I was desperate for money, but because I knew I couldn't keep it tucked away like something still waiting. With that money and a portion of my monthly retirement check, I divided it into 3 parts. One for rent, one to live on, and one to buy back the old wooden shelf the landlord planned to throw out. I cleaned it, revarnished it, and filled it with old books I'd collected from the library where I used to volunteer. Books discarded because no one checked them out anymore. I taped a note to the front window. "Every Saturday afternoon, if you'd like to read with a cup of chamomile tea, come in. No fee. No sign-up. Just silence your phone." No one came in the first week. Still, I brewed tea and set out an extra chair. The second week, an older woman wearing a plum-colored beret asked if I had Garcia Marquez. I handed her a tattered copy of Love in the Time of Cholera and poured us some tea. She didn't say much. But at the end, she left a small note folded in for, "Thank you for an afternoon that asked nothing of me but to simply be here." From that moment I understood. I wasn't lonely. I had just been living in the wrong house with people who didn't know how to be present. Now each day I wake up before 7, unlock the door, sweep the stone porch, and place a few wild daisies into a glass bottle I use as a vase. I've relearned how to cook for one, just enough, nothing wasted, no leftovers meant for someone else. I wash my clothes by hand because I like the feel of smoothing fabric with my fingers, the scent of soap lingering at my cuffs, a habit that never truly left me. I log my expenses by hand, write in a journal every night, and no longer sleep with my phone beneath my pillow. I don't lie down waiting for a message for the first time in years. No one's asking for money. No one's asking where I am. But I don't feel forgotten. On the contrary, each day I have a standing date with myself, a date I never miss. I've found joy again in the sound of a spoon tapping against a cup, in the hiss of boiling water, and even in arranging books as if smoothing out memories. One morning I opened the little mailbox by the door and found a small, neatly written note. I saw you left the group chat. I know you're okay. But if you'll let me, I'd like to visit. No signature. But I knew who it was. I folded the paper and tucked it into the journal I was writing in. I didn't reply. I didn't refuse. Just not yet. Because I'm still relearning how to love, starting with myself before I can forgive anyone else, and maybe that is the hardest yet most worthwhile thing a woman who once lost herself can do, to return not to be needed but to be whole. I was wiping down old glass jars when I heard a knock at the door. 3 taps, light but steady, like someone who once knew I never liked the shrill ring of a doorbell. Outside, a fine mist was falling, clinging to the stone steps in front of the shop and making everything feel soft and damp. I washed my hands, strolled over, and gently pulled back the curtain. It was Ivan, the boy who once held my hand crossing the street. The boy who once asked why anchovies and olive oil tasted like rain. Now he stood nearly as tall as the doorframe, his hair longer, a worn canvas tote with his high school's logo slung over his shoulder. I didn't open the door right away. I stood still momentarily, as if my heart needed a few seconds to catch up with the rest of me. Ivan saw me. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. Audible through the glass, he just said, "I came to talk, Grandma." I turned the lock. The door opened. No greeting. No blame. Just the return of an old air, heavy with the weight of unsent letters. "You came alone?" I asked. Ivan nodded. "My parents don't know. They think you're just staying with a friend." I invited him in. The room was warm from the kettle I'd already boiled and the soft amber glow of the desk lamp. I poured tea and set a cup in front of him. Ivan glanced around like someone stepping into an old dream. He looked at the jar of olives I'd just arranged, at the chalkboard where I'd written that morning's note. Saturday, reading 1,000 years of good prayers with chamomile tea. "This place," he began, "is where I lived with your grandpa," I finished for him. "Where I used to live before that house." Ivan didn't look at me. "I heard Mom and Dad say you were mad. That you'd never come back." I smiled. Not sad. Not forced. Just still. "I'm not mad. I just stopped waiting." Silence settled in. The rain softened on the tiled roof. Ivan reached into his bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A drawing. Colored pencil. A woman behind a grocery counter, jars of jam on the shelves, and a carefully printed line below it. "Abuela, you're like golden light when it rains." "I drew this in elementary school," he said. "But I never gave it to you." I said nothing. I placed the paper on the shelf beside the borrowed books. Ivan looked around once more. "Will you come home?" I shook my head. "That's not my home anymore. And I think you know that." He didn't respond, then nodded. Slightly. Before he left, he stood at the door for a long time. I didn't walk him to the end of the alley. I just said, "When you truly want to visit, not because you feel guilty but because you miss me, just come in. I don't lock the door during the day." He walked off without turning back. But just before he rounded the corner, I saw him pause, lift a hand to his face. The rain kept falling. But I didn't feel cold. I went inside, folded the drawing, and placed it into the old glass jar that had roasted almonds. Not to hide it, but to keep it. This proves that the things we once hurt over can one day become a quiet kind of tenderness if we are brave enough to stand through the first sharp sting of honesty. I found the old will in the white-painted drawer where I kept all the papers I once thought mattered. House deed, Ivan's immunization records, even wire transfer receipts from 8 years ago. The will was written back when I believed giving was enough to be loved. The scrawled line in my handwriting leaving everything to my son, so he can handle things when I'm gone, now reads like a small cut. Not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to sting. I drew a straight line with a red pen through the heir's name. No hesitation. No regret. It no longer felt like betrayal, just a long overdue correction made in the name of self-respect. The next morning, I went to the lawyer's office, a small second-floor room overlooking the town square. The same square where Matthew and I once stood eating ice cream on a scorching afternoon. The lawyer was a young woman with brown hair tied back neatly, wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice as soft as turning pages. She listened while I told everything. About the grocery store, about Matthew, about the house I'd helped pay for, baked in, stayed silent in until I couldn't anymore. When I finished, she didn't speak right away. She nodded, then asked, "And who would you like to leave it to?" I paused. I didn't have much. No stocks, no real estate beyond this rented space. But I had some retirement money, a few pieces of jewelry, what now felt like my whole world. I said, "I want to create a small fund. Doesn't have to bear my name. Just let it be for women like I used to be, older women pushed to the margins, who thought it was too late to start over." The lawyer scribbled notes and asked if I had a specific organization in mind. I gave her the name of the old public library where I used to work, the one with the leaking roof still waiting to be fixed, and 3 shelves for senior readers left unmanaged. I said, "That place helped me believe that some things can still be repaired, if someone is willing to try." When the paperwork was done, I walked down the stone steps, feeling like I had set down a heavy, unnamed burden. On the way home, I stopped at a stationery store and bought a set of postcards. I wrote one to myself to be sent to my current address. "Welcome home. Here no one demands. Only someone listens." I stamped it, dropped it into the red mailbox, and returned to the shop. Dusk had settled in. Inside, the warm glow of the lamp was still steady. The scent of the cinnamon cookies I'd baked that morning lingered faintly in the air. I sat down at the counter and opened the notebook I'd been writing in. I added one last line. "I will leave nothing to those who never saw me as a person, but I'll leave a chance for those who understand the value of a second beginning." I closed the notebook, poured myself a cup of tea, and turned on the radio. A soft piano piece floated out. Outside, the rain fell lightly, but inside I was dry and unburdened. Not because I had won anything, but because I no longer needed anyone's permission to feel worthy of love. Dignity, I've learned, isn't about how much I give. It's about knowing when to stop and finding the courage to pull back from a hand that only ever reached out when it needed something. Not everyone has a cruel family, but many have quietly endured the feeling of being overlooked in their own home. Isabel's story doesn't begin with a tragedy or end in some dramatic confrontation. It's the quiet, weighty journey of a woman who once believed that giving was enough to be loved. We are often taught to sacrifice, especially mothers and grandmothers, to give without expecting anything in return, because family love is unconditional. But it's precisely that belief that has turned many into gentle-talking ATMs, as Isabel once heartbreakingly overheard herself described. No one should have to earn affection through their presence, and no one should have to trade dignity just to be seen as applicable. Maybe you too have been hurt. Perhaps you felt like a shadow in your own family. But like Isabel, we all have the right to step out of that role, not with demands or anger, but with a straightforward decision. I will live for me from now on. Her awakening didn't come from rage, but from the moment she stopped hoping that people who only took would one day start giving. And in that moment she finally became fully herself, whole, independent, and unafraid. This story doesn't tell us to walk away from our loved ones. It reminds us not to walk away from ourselves. No one will call our name when we step back. But what matters is that we still know how to contact our name with full respect. And sometimes that alone is enough to begin again.